Senator David Pocock.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. I rise to offer a brief contribution on these bills. In doing so, I want to acknowledge my crossbench colleague, Senator Lambie, and her team for their work and sharing a commitment to work constructively on the legislation before us. These bills represent 4 simple measures that could make a big difference to our communities right now. They are straightforward, have broad support and can literally change lives. The first bill would better support our fireys, our AMBOs, our police and our emergency services to access compensation for PTSD that develops as part of their job. Our first responders come into monthly, weekly and sometimes daily contact with death, violence and injury. They witness tragedies on a regular basis that many of us may only witness once or twice in our lives. This extends to the phone operators in our emergency services, who I think are under-recognised for the extremely important service they provide to our communities. In speaking with some operators, I've been told some truly awful stories about the calls they need to take on a daily basis. And this clearly takes a toll. Prevention of mental health injury should always be the priority, but we know that that's not always possible, given the nature of the work our first responders do. So early intervention has to be the next most important goal, and I believe our services are getting much better at this. But it won't work for everyone, and that's because trauma is a complex thing and it's very individual. For one person, exposure to one traumatic event may be enough to precipitate into post-traumatic stress disorder. For some, PTSD could develop after repeated exposure over a 20-year period. It's a complicated illness, but we know that our first responders shoulder a very high burden of PTSD. And for those who've had family members with PTSD, you'll know just what a toll that takes on the entire family. It is a huge thing for a family to go through to support a family member with PTSD. And you take paramedics, some studies show that the prevalence of PTSD is as high as 10 or 11%. That's 1 in 10 paramedics. For our first responders, PTSD is an occupational disease, and so our compensation system must stand ready to support them and to fund the services that will put them on the possible pathway to recovery. Unfortunately, from the moment I was elected, I've heard from first responders that our compensation system is not working in this way. It's not recognising them and supporting them in the way that it should. What I've heard is that first responders are being left to fight with insurers such as Comcare for access to compensation that would fund their treatments for PTSD. This happens because it's difficult to prove that PTSD develops as part of someone's job. It's difficult to point to one moment in a person's career and to say, that was the moment where I developed PTSD. It's difficult for a person to trawl through their memory at all the loss they may have seen throughout their career and tally the moments that have contributed to them developing PTSD. The very task of listing the dates of those traumatic events would be daunting, if not impossible. It would be harder still while you're struggling with PTSD, knowing the toll that it's taking on your loved ones as well, working each day to keep your mental health in check. When you start out in one of the services, you need to have a physical and mental health clearance. It seems rather obvious that if a first responder has PTSD, then it has developed as part of their job. This bill flips the equation. When this bill passes, insurers will need to presume that PTSD was caused by a first responder's job. And if an insurer disagrees, then it's on them to prove that it wasn't. This was a key recommendation of the 2019 Senate inquiry, the people behind OOO. And I want to acknowledge Senator Anne Urquhart the Senator for Tasmania for her role in establishing the committee and for driving forward those recommendations over the last few years. Clearly, there's a lot of support for first responders from Tasmanian senators. I will take the opportunity to remind the Senate that there were 12 other recommendations in the report that we should not forget. It includes reforming how insurers order independent medical examinations. I've heard too many stories of first responders having to front up to 3, 5, or in one case 9 different independent medical examinations. These examinations are, by their nature, confronting, and they can feel combative. By necessity, they also require people to speak about and recount their traumas, which can re-traumatise people in the grips of PTSD. They are necessary. You cannot eliminate them from the system, but clearly insurers need to be careful in ordering them. Finally, on this provision, I wanted to give a shout-out to the Heart to Heart crew, who recently completed an almost 3,000 kilometre journey across Australia to raise awareness of first responder mental health and to push for the recommendations of the 2019 Senate inquiry, the people behind 000, to be implemented in full. And today is the first step in that. It's the least that we can do for their service to our communities and to our country, for being there for us in our greatest, most terrible hours of need. So I'll finish off with this particular bill by saying thank you to our police, our AMBOs, our firefighters, our emergency services and the operators sitting behind 000. Thank you for putting your health and well-being on the line for our communities. Thank you for having our backs. I hope this measure goes some way to looking after you as well. I'll try and keep my remarks on the remaining 3 bills very brief. The small business redundancy exemption provision is a long-standing feature of our workplace relations system. Senator Lambie, in her contribution, highlighted the loophole and statistics here. This is a very welcome change. I would also highlight the need for the Parliament to deal with security of payments. That's something where politicians are failing our tradies, are failing subcontractors who do work and then don't get paid for that work, and it's something that we have to take more seriously. The Strengthening Protections Against Discrimination bill corrects an oversight that we all made last year when establishing the Family and Domestic Violence Leave entitlement. While it is illegal for an employer to discriminate against someone for taking family and domestic violence, it's actually not technically illegal for an employer to discriminate against someone on the basis that they are experiencing domestic violence. This bill fixes that by making a subjection to family and domestic violence a protected attribute in the Fair Work Act. In practice, women's legal services have told me it will be a nuanced but very important protection that will ensure people are protected from discrimination before they are ready to access their leave entitlement. And sadly, we know, despite the new national plan, family and domestic violence is on the rise. Finally, the Fair Work Legislation Amendment, Asbestos Safety Eradication Agency Bill 2023, will add silicosis into the remit of the Asbestos Safety and Eradication Agency. If this bill passes, ASEA will develop and maintain a national silicosis plan and help to coordinate efforts across all levels of government. Silicosis, predominantly from working with engineered stone, is killing workers, is killing Australians. We know the dangers, and yet still governments, state, territory and federal, have failed to ban it. We need more courage from policymakers to step up on the issue of engineered stone. It is not acceptable to have the evidence, to have recommendations to ban it, and not to have the political courage to follow through with that to protect workers in Australia. These are 4 bills that, from my read of this chamber, have multi-partisan support. I thank the government for drafting the legislation. I thank Minister Burke for including the PTSD provisions. It was a surprise to everyone, including the Australian Federal Police Association and others who'd been pushing for this for years, that it was part of this omnibus bill. And I know that they want to see it passed in full this year. On the omnibus bill, it is a beast of a bill, and I think the Senate is rightly taking its time to work through the other 20 sections in total. Here are 4. There'll be another 16 to work through in detail, and understand there will be a number of amendments, including a number of government amendments, and they are welcome, but there's clearly still more work to do. I'll continue to do my bit and uphold my commitment to the people of the ACT when it comes to the larger omnibus bill, to take each element on its merits and work on it in good faith. But that should not stop us of passing elements of this bill that have broad support, and as Senator Cash pointed out, have an earlier start date than many of the elements in the much larger omnibus bill.